Okay, one more question. I assume that you're familiar with the American David Stockman and his contrarian writings?
So the American?
David Stockman, The Great Deformation?
No.
No, okay. He writes a lot about the problems of the fiat currency in America, the increase in money printing. The escalating debt, the low interest, a lot of what you covered, and his prediction for America in the next decade or so is rather dismal.
Okay, and so to be fair, okay, so I'm kind of long in the tooth. I've been doing this for a while. That issue of fiat currency and destroying the world and everything else, I've heard those stories since Harry Browne wrote about them in 1970. And there's been a series of writers ever since then that have all Lord Rees-Mogg, Ravi Batra, you know, the Great Depression of '79. Like there's just been book after book after book, including Harry Dent maybe 15 years ago. So predicting the demise or the outcomes that will occur, because it seems logical that if a country just prints currency and has a great debt, basically the whole thing is going to blow up. And so a few years ago, I decided to kind of look into this more carefully, because in theory, if you have this big inflationary century, like the 20th century, most inflationary century in human history, you wouldn't want to own paper currency, you'd want to own gold. That would make sense, because gold protects you against inflation. And sure enough, if you bought $20 worth of gold in 1914, you would have got 1 ounce of gold. And today that gold is worth what, $1,200. So therefore, it's easily covered inflation. It only has to be worth $500 to equal inflation. It's worth $1,200. It's way better than inflation. But where the problem comes in is when governments borrow money, they actually pay interest. And if I took the same $20 and simply bought US bonds, which are just paper, today I can sell those bonds for $2,500, which is twice what I would have got from the gold. And I could have bought British bonds, I could have bought Canadian bonds, the story would have been just the same. So it always strikes me that if gold can't outperform paper currency in the most inflationary century in human history, when is it going to outperform paper currency? So I hear what you're saying, I've read the books, I do understand the logic of where they're going. It's just that I've never seen their theories come true, even though I'm seeing the same analysis being shown every few years.
Yeah, I think that the greater concern that I saw was that with the increasing U.S. debt, they've offshored a lot of their wealth-producing industries. I mean, there's only a few industries that actually produce wealth as opposed to reallocate it, that they will have a greater problem in the future being able to repay the debt. Because as you said, they do pay interest on the debt.
Yeah,
and
so Rob, do you want to mention?
Yeah, no, so one of the things, if we had gone back, let's go back in time before the financial crisis, so 2008. If you were to ask someone what you thought the next crisis was going to be, they probably wouldn't have said the US banking system and the global economy. They would have talked about the US dollar. And because the US, again, had these huge trade deficits, and it didn't seem sustainable that could continue. And that what if China were to sell their treasury bills, et cetera, and yet, as it evolved, the US economy became, again, the strongest economy, and it was the least dirty shirt, and the US dollar was very strong. So it didn't play out that way. But one of the things I tried to show with my presentation is that those imbalances are still there, and what happened played out a little differently, but it's still, those imbalances need to be mitigated in order to have a more sustainable growth in the longer term. So I think that does make sense, and I think one of the things I worry about is that and again it's this idea of deleveraging. You do need to deleverage, and if Donald Trump, and because he's talked about he's not worried about the debt, if he were to go on a big spending binge and you see that debt go higher, I think that is an issue. One thing to consider about with the U.S. though, in fairness to the U.S., if you are the world's reserve currency, that means that your liability is someone else's asset. And if the whole global economy is growing and you're the reserve currency, that means the supply of US dollars has to grow. So that's one of the reasons why the US can run those trade deficits. It's one of the reasons why the US can have so much debt, because of the reserve currency. If they stop becoming the reserve currency, that situation is going to have to change.
There's a connected issue which you read about in the papers on the Canadian side, where for years we've been talking about how indebted the average Canadian is. Record levels of debt in relation to income. And there's no question that those things are true. Unfortunately, StatsCan doesn't measure all levels of the way that that debt takes place. So 2 or 3 things get wrong in the data. The first is, when we borrow money, the cheapest place to borrow money is on a home. So let's say I want to start a business. Am I going to borrow money in the business? No, I'm going to borrow money in my home to put in the business because it's 1 or 2% a year cheaper. If I want to make an investment, will I borrow money for the investment or on my home to buy the investment? Same issue. So Stats Canada doesn't measure how much of the debt is actually being used to acquire assets as opposed to how much of it is used for spending. But what they do measure is the change in net worth. So net worth for Canadians is simply all their assets minus their liabilities. In other words, the debt has been taken out of it. And that has increased from about 400% of annual income, the average net worth of the average Canadian, to 600% over the last 20 years, which means Canadians, net of their debt, are wealthier by 50% than they were 20, 25 years ago. So that's the other part of the story, to say, yes, we have that debt, but what's on the other side of a balance sheet? The assets. And the story doesn't mean anything if the two are not brought together.
Thank you very much. It's been a great analysis tonight. Really smart. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.